I can understand that people can have illnesses that aren't readily apparent to those around them.
Yeah, it happens more than you think.
They're called invisible diseases, and today we're going to try to bring them out of the shadows. Hello again, I'm Mark Huffman in the United States.
And I'm Laura McKeever in the United Kingdom, and this is RX411, your prescription for health.
With science-based health news and information from both sides of the Atlantic, direct from rx411.com. Our topic today, invisible diseases.
Yeah, and these conditions are very real to the people who suffer from them, even though not everyone agrees that they're there.
If you've got a bad cold, well, everyone around you knows it because you're coughing and sneezing and hacking. And if you have a broken arm, well, you're wearing a cast. But there are a whole set of conditions that aren't so obvious. So how do you define an invisible disease?
So invisible diseases, which I discussed on the RX411 blog quite recently, are diseases that you can't actually see, but they still have very profound effects on the person who's suffering from them. So in a lot of cases, they technically cause that person to become disabled, but because their disability isn't always obvious, they meet resistance, both from everyday people and healthcare professionals. A really good example of this is fibromyalgia, where the patient can suffer from extreme pain throughout their body with no visible cause. And depression is another example, although a lot less stigmatized now. But still many people can expect that a depressed person would walk around in a state of woe and maybe being fit for, an asylum. And actually, usually it's people who are soldiering on through everyday life, and all of a sudden something causes them to not want to go out or, liaise with others. And because we can't really x-ray these diseases or carry out measurable blood tests, they're difficult to diagnose as well.
Yeah, you mentioned fibromyalgia. I remember my aunt suffered from that and really got no sympathy from members of her own family. What do we know about fibromyalgia?
So we don't actually know a great deal, and it's incredibly controversial. And one of the main reasons for that is that it's a very prolonged diagnosis of exclusion. So it falls under a rheumatologist, and once a rheumatologist has excluded diseases that we can do certain blood tests for, such as arthritis, or tests that we can x-ray for, such as osteoarthritis, and they can't find what's causing this extreme pain, they'll fall with a diagnosis of fibromyalgia. And I think that causes some people to think, it's not real. And even the way it's taught in medical schools, at least over here, to me, makes it seem as though patients are up for a challenging journey. And one of the more offensive acronyms I came across, FFF, to describe the epidemiology was fat, female, and 40. Now, if that isn't inflammatory, which is a pun, I don't know what is. And because healthcare professionals see fibromyalgia as being exaggerated, there's this delay in diagnosis, they're not treated brilliantly, and then they're sort of understandably put off wanting to see a doctor overall.
Is it a condition that mostly strikes women?
Yeah, it's primarily from, at least based on the epidemiology that we have here in the UK, and I know there's a lot of crossover with the US, it's not exclusive to women, but it is primarily women. Now, I don't know whether that could direct researchers towards potential causes to look into. 40 doesn't really seem to suggest that it has anything to do with, say, the menopause, but maybe the perimenopause. I'm pretty much just guessing here. But yeah, it's pretty much women.
Yeah, my aunt was well past 40 when she developed it. Switching from physical pain to mental pain, and you mentioned depression is another of the invisible conditions. And again, people who suffer from it don't always get sympathy, but do they get more of it than they did in the past? I mean, or do we understand it better now?
I think we do understand it better now. And I think objectively, and from what I've read, there's been quite a positive shift in how well we understand people with depression and how we approach them over the last, say, 2 to 3 decades. But it's still quite a tricky beast to tackle. I think this is partially because it exists over such a large spectrum and it can fluctuate. So, somebody who has depression might seem okay on the outside, but then their peers and colleagues, as a result, might not take them seriously when they say that they can't sleep, they're not enjoying life, they're too anxious to socialize with other people. And there's still a little bit of this stigma, despite the movements that we've made in terms of being forward thinking, that someone can think their way out of it or snap out of it. And recently we've seen quite a startling rise in male suicides. And I think that's possibly because even though we've made progress with depression, we're still not quite there with taking it seriously. Being open about emotions and being depressed still isn't encouraged.
And then there's chronic fatigue syndrome, and people who are always tired and lack energy can sometimes get a bad rap, can't they?
Definitely. And I think, again, a lot of the stigma that surrounds chronic fatigue syndrome perhaps stems from us all believing that people should respond to things in the same way that we do. And chronic fatigue is thought to have a viral element. So it's a virus that will trigger this long-lasting fatigue. And one of the main viruses is mono, aka glandular fever. And because most of us tend to bounce back from these viruses quite quickly, we might become frustrated when another person doesn't, and they have this prolonged fatigue. And when chronic fatigue syndrome progresses to the state where it fluctuates and somebody appears normal, for want of a better word, on one day, and then they're absolutely exhausted the next, a lot of people start to believe that perhaps they're being melodramatic when that isn't the case. It's a very real condition.
And are there treatments for all three of these conditions or any of these conditions?
So the treatments for depression appear to be always advancing. There's a lot of options out there, and I think it's now mainly agreed for at least mild and moderate cases that a combination of talking therapies and SSRIs work well. And the idea is that SSRIs will support you through the chemical imbalance in your brain as the talking therapies help you develop better coping mechanisms and deal with perhaps a triggering trauma. More severe cases require very different medications that are within the scope of psychiatrists rather than general practitioners, and occasionally being admitted to a ward. Unfortunately, chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia don't have direct treatments as such. It's a lot of focus on symptom management, and those symptom management medications in themselves aren't great. For example, I don't know what it's like in the States, but some of the neurological medications used, such as gabapentin, are very effective, but they're also very addictive. And so they can be prescribed, but they're classed as what we call a Class C drug, which means, there's criminal intent if you're found to be passing them on to someone else, which you shouldn't do with any drug anyway, but it sort of stigmatizes it a bit. Opiates can be used, but only on a short-term basis. Doctors will look into helping people form lifestyle changes, but from what I've seen, if somebody with CFS or fibromyalgia has had a run-in with a few negative doctors who don't believe them, when they come to the genuine one who's trying to help them make positive lifestyle changes, they might start to resist that.
You were talking about medications in the United States and probably in the UK. There's an effort among policymakers and in the healthcare community to pull away from opioid drugs because they have become such a problem with addiction. And, people who are in intense pain need something to alleviate that. So I guess it's a problem. It's a double-edged problem. It's a problem of the drug can be overused and people can become addicted. On the other hand, if they're withdrawn completely, people that need relief from pain might not be getting it.
Yeah, they sort of cease to function. And I guess if you can support someone through their pain so that they can play with their kids, work, do their usual exercise and hobbies, then pain medication, when managed properly, is never a bad thing.
So just because you can't see the outward signs, it doesn't mean that physical and mental pain isn't real. A reminder, though, for all the science-based health news and information, your one-stop source is your prescription for health, rx411.com. That's going to do it for us. Until next time, I'm Mark Huffman, hoping you stay pain-free.
And I'm Laura McKeever, urging you to seek medical help even when the symptoms aren't obvious to everyone else.
Good advice. So long, everybody.